This is Pat Windrow again at the Cable Easel on Viacom. Welcome to a program dedicated to painting and drawing and demonstrations of the techniques of those two subjects. Today it's part 2 of a program which was done in the painting of Setauket Harbor, a local area in the town of Brookhaven, and I seem to be the great landscape recorder of this area. So we went out with a monitor, which you can see on your screen, and camera rather, and we shot a scene of Setauket Harbor. It is live. As you can see, the water is moving. Possibly the birds will be flying by. And that means that we're not actually working from a still photograph or a still drawing or a still painting. We're working from a monitor, which is the best way we can bring the outdoors indoors. This monitor behind me here looks as though I'm looking out of a window with a little bit of stretching of the imagination, and that means that it is doing exactly what I continually say, and that is to work from life. If you can't work from life because you work all day and you want to paint at night, you can at least work from a monitor, so from a television. So here is here's an innovative idea of doing that. Part 2 of Setauket Harbor, which will probably be the title of this painting, and this is where we left off the last time. Having dealt with bands of color, namely this is a band of pale, this is a band of the green color, here's a little band in the center of Long Island Sound and parts of Connecticut in the great distance, the beach area here in the middle ground, and then beginning to work on the water area. And until this point, up to this point, this is nothing but ribbons of color. However, this diagonal, which has been introduced as the foreground and part of the land, is what gives the painting and this composition depth. It is an important, not trick, but it's an important piece of information to know that depth is accomplished by the use of diagonals. The most primary lesson in drawing involves the famous telephone poles that go from the distance point all the way up to the foreground in a triangle. So here's where we're dealing with the same kind of thing that you may or may not have been exposed to in classes when you were a small child in school. Well, here's my palette, which to me looks like it's wonderfully clean and organized. A lot of people would say it's a terrible mess, but that's the way palettes look. Now I'm going to be going with the water area in the foreground, and as it comes towards you, for some strange and unaccountable reason, foreground water becomes very dark. It changes. That's why working from life is a vital asset to landscape painting, because all of these supposedly unexplainable happenings take place. I'm mixing the color that I'm going to be using in the foreground of the water, slightly darker than the other, and applied with a knife, not only to be able to get it on smoothly, but also it is a quick way in which to paint a landscape, and rapidity is vital, because you're dealing with a changing sun, possibly a changing weather condition, and maybe the inability to get back there the next day at the same time. So working with speed is not necessarily a trick of an accomplished painter, but it's also a necessity. So I'm putting this color on with very deliberate but apparently crude technique, and I'm going to use this brush to smooth out the mist areas and the knife marks, because when I'm dealing in a realistic mode of painting, I want to make sure that I have not got unduly rough texture. That's a different style. That is palette knife style. I'll be dealing with that at another time, in which the brush isn't introduced at all. Here is according to what my reference material is the beginning of the foreground. I'm going to use just a slight touch of turpentine to smooth this on. I don't use oil very often because it makes a really unfortunate mess. Now, as you can see, there is activity in the foreground here with waves, small as they are, casting shadows and giving you ripples. Other programs will tell you that you can denote water by pulling tricks, such as taking a fan brush and pulling color down into what presumably is going to look like waves or something. No, they have to be done very deliberately. There is also a slight curve to these waves. And the observation of this comes purely from being out there and observing it. It is not a formula. You can't possibly say that the wave formations are going to be the same in all painting. They vary with all sorts of conditions. Now, because water is a mass of, although it's very volatile, it is a mass of that casts shadows like any other object. I've changed my brush to a shorter bristle, a round cut brush, in order to show you a little bit the interpretive way in which one would do these waves in the foreground. They're not easy to do, but they take observation. I've put the shadow color in first, namely the darker, and now I'm applying, apparently, what is the top of a sunlit wave. This is a technique which I have developed over the years. Every painter who paints this kind of thing has observed this, and I'm sure that if you look at some of the classic marine painters, you'll be able to see that this is exactly the way they've been doing it for hundreds of years. A wonderful Venetian painter called Canaletto and Guardi, all the little paintings of Venice of the 15th and 16th and 17th century are done with the little waves in this manner. It's also to be done with care and deliberation and a certain nice, loose, interpretive style. When you step back, the effect should be acceptable enough to pass for waves. Now I'm going to start to work on the dock area, which is in the center. This painting is, to all intents and purposes, as if the harbor were totally deserted. But it isn't. When we went out there, we found that there was a great deal of activity going on at the Setauket boat basin. So now that we've prepared this, and I have worked with something called Grumbacher's Quick Drying MG White. That's the name of it. It's not magic. It is it's got a lot of collodion in it, which is a drying agent. And it's very useful for me and for anyone who decides to work out of doors, because it prepares the background to receive all of these details in the middle. Now, let me draw it a little bit first with this finer brush, a touch of turpentine and some dark color. I'm going to lay out the dock as I see it here on my reference material. It is a floating dock, and its location is approximately here and comes in the middle, and then it's got some pilings holding up the floating dock for when the tide comes, and the pilings intersect the sky. They are in the foreground. That means that they are taller than anything in the distance. Here are two larger, fatter ones that apparently are holding up another part of this floating dock, and then the dock goes, and this involves some drawing, but I'm showing you a technique in which you draw right on the canvas. Theirs is floating without any anchor, so we must anchor this dock, and it has a raised area which is a ramp, and that goes up and down with the tide, and here's where it goes to the land and becomes part of the Setauket boat basin. It has a piling here, rather fat pilings here, as you can see, and I'm painting right over the prepared and almost dry background that I put in before. So you would not paint around these pilings. You would prepare the background first, and so that you would be given the opportunity to make the details on top of it. Just a perfectly logical way of handling small items against a large background. Now, coming down here, we have two more, not very visible in the monitor, but they are nevertheless there. And sketching them in with my what I call probably tinted turpentine. It isn't actually paint, it is just a dark tinted turpentine. And there is the handrails go up to this one, and the other one is directly behind that. And this comes from being out there and observing this particular scene. It is always very rewarding to be able to understand what it is that is of interest out there when you have, you know, possibly driven around and wondered, well, I don't see anything that is interesting. Then suddenly you see one of these wonderful structures, such as this dock out there in Setauket Harbor. The shadow, I'm taking another brush now because I need to use a darker color. The shadow of the dock is underneath and in the water. That would be the color of the water, only slightly darker, just a little bit darker. So I'm using some ultramarine blue, a touch of the spectrum violet, and putting in the shadows of the pilings. Also, while I'm at it, and I have the dark color, I will give you an interpretive reflection of those pilings, which immediately tells you that water is below there. Even though sometimes reflections do not tell that story. The simpler manner in which you do the reflections, the better. But certainly don't ever rely upon the accidentals of possibly pulling wet color down onto an area and call that a reflection. It simply won't work. It's more annoying than it is amusing, actually. So here we have, with the darker color on my brush, these pilings, very cooperative the way they are reflected in the water. And this one apparently also has one, and it interrupts itself, and as we go along, that's another repetition. The reference material is very clear as to what's happening, and in this wind disturbance here, the reflections stop. The reflections are taking place only in the lighter area where the water is a little calmer than it is in the foreground, where apparently there is a gust of wind causing those, causing the waves to take place. Let's see, there is also, the dock continues a rather good distance way off here. Let me get that in. And, well, darker please, there we go. And there is another piling at the very end to tell you that that's the end of the dock. All of these things are extremely clear when you're out there. They also can be done from sketches. If you have the ability to sketch and to make color notations verbally with what you see, then you will be able to certainly work, not have to lug the paints out to the site and work from there with the weather conditions as they are. But for the most part, it is much better to go out there and to work from life. I'm going to begin to sketch in, or to put in, these wonderful boats at mooring. Now, they are, this is not an ad for a marine sails. So the boats are going to be done rather loosely, without too much attention to detail. What you're trying to do is to merely suggest that there is a boat out there. Too much detail is first of all not painterly, and secondly it gets in the way of the general composition. One's attention is focused on the detail of a boat where it shouldn't be. It should be focused on the whole thing. The reflection of the boat is obvious. It comes below that blue water line, and it is going to probably just be a slight suggestion of what is happening out there. And when we come back, I'm going to show you how to steady one's hand and use something called a maul stick. It's a perfectly ridiculous word for something which is used to steady the hand. So Don't go away. We'll be right back with the painting of the little boats in Setauket Harbor. Thank you. Again, to the painting of these boats in Setauket Harbor. I mentioned a moment before using a maul stick. This is actually nothing more than a long-handled brush. I'm going to show you how people say, how do you ever do a very fine line? You lean. I'm going to lean the brush against the sky because the sky is now dried, having done it before. And I'm leaning my hand on this stick. As you can see, that is what is absolutely necessary in order to be able to get some leverage and the ability to run a straight and careful line. And you don't breathe and talk when you do it. So that it takes practice. There's no question about it. I wouldn't presume to say that the first time that you do this you'll be able to make it work. But it certainly is vital to know the technique which one uses in order to be able to steady the brush. This may look a little bit rough, but that is purposeful. I'm not interested, as I said earlier, to do a salesman's drawing of the. I'm going to mucked up the sky there, but nevertheless we can fix that later. Well, we have the little boats back. Get my palette back, and we're going to show you what is called interpretive rendering of motifs in the distance and in the foreground. It is arbitrary. It's something that you need to do. It's what the Impressionists did so beautifully at the turn of the century and which revolutionized painting. So, meaning that in just suggesting certain shapes, you get the story given to you about what is happening out there. And I believe that anyone will recognize the fact that just one swipe of a brush with white paint on it is not going to in fact make a boat, but it gives you the impression of a boat and gives you the impression of distance items which should be, as is called in the theater, simply thrown away. When you have a line that you don't want to make a point of, it just gets sort of thrown away. I'm going to, as long as I've got white on my brush, I'm going to give you that buoy that I see in the foreground here, and nicely enough it also is casting a wonderful reflection in the water. So when you find yourself with these very nice and cooperative items, take advantage of them. So I'm dealing now with the patterns of the boats that are harbored here. I notice that there are also different colored boats, which means that probably those are the little rowboats known as dories to take you out to your boat, and they are in pure orange to give you just the feeling and a little reflection below them, as long as you've got your brush there in the color, and just give an impression of what they are. My material tells me that there are two more over here, and these are the things that make a painting interesting. It was perfectly all right to just have an uninhabited and a deserted harbor, but the minute you begin to put in the other elements of design, you'll find that in selecting a landscape, there is a great deal to do with looking for the interesting details. Many times I have said it is not the painting of the landscape that is the problem, it's the finding of it and the setting up and doing what interests you at that time. I must speak for a moment about what you're seeing on the monitor as far as the color of the sky is concerned and my color. There are irregularities in the transmission of color from one set to the other. And my particular, and this monitor is showing the sky in a far more vibrant blue than it really is. So if anybody is out there watching saying, well, those colors don't look like the ones we see, it has to be forgiven because it is a question of the discrepancies in color transmission from one monitor to the other. As a colorist, I know that that particular sky that you're seeing on the monitor is far too blue and too electronically false. So that is not to try and vindicate myself, it is just to explain to you the questions that you may have in your mind about what is happening with the color there. This is, after all, a visual program, and it has to be able to make sense. And your questions, I hope, are answered by that. I'm putting out a book which is going to be entitled Working from Life with Patricia Windrow. I will show you a sample of it the next time I'm on a program, and then you'll be able to send for it, and I will hopefully be able to accommodate any requests that you might have to purchase it. I'm going to now start working on the foreground, which is the same kind of thing. Observation is what we have to deal with. I'm going to be mixing my color for the foreground. As you can see, I'm going to use some of the blue color that I have left over on my palette because economy is also an essential part of painting. And I'm going to be mixing the foreground, a little bit of raw sienna, which is vital to the mixing of a believable green, and putting it on with as much simplicity as I have done the rest of it, so that you can learn about my techniques and maybe find them useful for you. I'll have them in my book. But here we are live to show you just how to manage something which may be a little perplexing to people who are sitting out there saying, well, I simply can't make head or tail out of any of that stuff in the foreground. I grant you, it is confusing, but it's like anything else. Once you have observed it and understood it, then it is absolutely plausible. I'm going to show you that with a smaller brush, I'm working up these grasses to be in front of the water. That's why I went down a little bit farther with the blue of the water, so that I can accommodate my need to put the grass in the foreground. That brush is not working very well, so let me find another one here. Here, this is a good one. No, this is the better one. The brush is as I said before, the important thing, so do invest in the brush. Grass is very tricky. It needs to be very closely observed, and many times grass is a great deal paler than what you think. You think it's green, but the sun has hit it and has made it less than green. It's made it so pale. Sometimes, if you look at it when the sun is out, go down to the beach and look at the grass and see that sometimes the grass appears to be almost white because of the way the smoothness of the leaves catches the sun. Grass is also curved. It bends with the wind. It's also different kinds of grass that do different kinds of things. And this kind of technique that I'm showing you is probably the most difficult part of this painting, because to use a light hand with a brush requires a lot of practice. However, there is no need to let it intimidate you. Just get a brush that is fine enough bristles, reduce the paint to an ink-like consistency, and use a very light technique whereby the brush hits the canvas and then it leaves it. This kind of technique is useful in probably all phases of painting, whether it's in this kind of grass in the foreground, or if it's in the leaves, the veins of leaves, the veins and patterns in flowers. So to develop this kind of technique is really essential to good painting. Frustrating as it may seem, don't hesitate to keep doing it until you can really master it, or at least get close to it. There is a mysterious kind of shape in the foreground here, which is probably an abandoned log of some sort, or an old piling, or maybe even one of those great 8x8s that support boats in the boatyard. And it's all mixed up with, well, flotsam and jetsam and stuff that accumulates in boatyards, to be done in a very interpretive way, because, as I said, we are not painting the details of anything in particular. We're trying to get the flavor of an area, which means that when you can just indicate possibly that there are, well, old cement blocks that used to support boats, an old piling, and general disarray that you will find in boatyards, that will be the way that details can be taken care of. Well, we're coming to almost the conclusion of this particular study. It has come from being observant of the land in the area. There is nothing sophisticated or grand about these landscapes. They are merely recordings of the area in which we live, available to you just as they are to me. The only problem between you and me is that you must find the time in your life to be able to go out and paint from life. It is essential that you realize that using the second dimension as reference material and transferring it to another second dimension will not give you the same as the challenge of taking the third dimension, which is out there, and transferring it to this flat area, the second dimension, and trying to make it believable. So with this general kind of, well, attitude about how to do landscape painting in mind, I hope that this kind of thing has been of some value to you, that you have learned about the use of various kinds of brushes, that you have learned about the business of working from the background to the foreground. I'll be doing it again with other scenes of the area. The area that I'm going to be covering is the townships of Brookhaven, parts of Brookhaven, Islip, Smithtown, and I believe parts of Huntington. So if you have the time, the inclination, and the general absolute obsession to go out and paint, by all means, I hope that you will be able to recall and remember some of the things that I have told you on this program. Thank you for watching the birth of Setauket Harbor as a landscape painting in the realistic style. This is Patricia Windrow at the Cable Easel, bidding you bye-bye, and thank you for watching.